Okay, Hannah, and here,
And
I'm gonna...
Hala, I just need to ask Emmy a question.
Yes.
Hi, Emmy, it's so good to meet you.
Hi.
Hello, I'd like to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. Could you pronounce it for me?
Yeah, obviously. It's Wienhoven.
Wienhoven. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
perfect.
I will do my best Dutch accent when I say it.
I'm sure you'll be great.
Wonderful.
Perdón, yo agrego un dato. No soy ministra, estoy en el cargo de subsecretaria. No sé si eso se explica mejor porque no es un dato correcto.
Are you able to change your title on the screen by renaming yourself?
Ah, sí, perfecto. Lo hago. Gracias.
We're live on YouTube. I sent you the link. But I can't make more people co-hosts, so...
I think we're all set. I've made everyone that's speaking today that's on a co-host, and I'm not sure if everyone, I know some folks have come on the line and have tested their audio, but if whoever hasn't, if they want to jump on and test audio and video, that would be fantastic, and we'll launch in maybe a minute or two.
That's me. I haven't tested yet, so I hope you can hear and see me. Great.
Perfect.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
That's great.
Hello,
Hi, everybody.
Hi,
Glad
Ambassador. Hannah, if you're there, I don't think that we've tested your video, although we heard your audio for a moment. Could you come on camera?
Yes. Oops. Sorry.
I can see that something is happening, so that's a good sign.
Yes, sorry. I will just check if it's the other way around. Sorry, I'll try once more. Or I just take my other device.
Sahar, would you like me to post the YouTube live on Facebook? Is that something like you promised?
If we could, that would be great, because we have told people that it would be on our Facebook page. So if you could put it somewhere that they'd be able to see that it's now gone to YouTube, that would be great.
Sure, I'll do that now.
Thank you so much, Hala.
I know that we're about to start, but let me just ask all of our speakers, do you have any questions before we begin?
Just wondering, do you think I need a headphone, or is that possible like that? Does it work?
We hear you perfectly, Sarah.
I was going to make my usual joke about that I was going to speak for an hour, but it's getting so old. So 7 minutes.
I always think that joke is funny.
You're kind. You're too kind.
Voy a hablar en español. Ya lo puse en español. Estoy probando a ver si ustedes ya pueden ver la traducción o no. ¿La pueden ver?
I understood you in Spanish, but I did not hear interpretation in English. Can we try that again?
Sí, cómo no. Bueno, que quería hablar en español para probar.
Yes,
¿sí?
now I hear it.
Perfecto.
Perfect.
Listo, buenísimo. Gracias.
So we're
Wonderful.
a minute out. If it's okay with everyone, I'm going to turn off my camera and go in the background, and now I'll start the webinar itself. So we're about to go fully live.
Okay,
Thank you,
Sahar,
Sahar.
I have the
Wonderful
start webinar button on my screen right now. I think we probably all do as co-hosts, but we'll leave it to you to publish it.
Yep, I'm going to go ahead now and click the button.
Can you wait one more second? Hannah,
Yeah,
can
sure.
we just make sure everything is good with your video?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. No final questions? All right, can't wait to have a wonderful conversation, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. All right, go ahead, Sahar, take it away. Hello, everyone. We're so happy to welcome you here today. My name is Jessica Stern. I'm the Executive Director of Outright Action International. And first, let me just take care of some housekeeping. We will have interpretation today in English and Spanish. So if you go to the bottom bar of your Zoom panel, you'll have a round icon and you can choose English or Spanish, the language of your choice. Please do, because our conversation will be wonderful and you don't want to miss a moment of it. We're using a webinar format in Zoom, which means you can post questions in the Q&A to make sure all of our panelists can see what you have to say. And you can also use the chat feature to speak either to all of the attendees or just to the panelists directly. Please feel free. We try to make this as animated as possible, even when we're in a virtual context, because after all, it's Pride, and what is Pride without interaction? And I'd also like to invite everyone who's listening to please introduce yourself. Use the chat feature to say hello, say your name, where you're based, your institutional affiliation, and maybe one thing that's your favorite thing about Pride. Try to just restrict it to one if you possibly can. All right, now I'm going to take us into the start of our program. Let me formally welcome you all to our panel, Assisting Human Rights Defenders on the Ground, LGBTI Inclusion in Foreign Policy and International Development, with a focus on best practices. Today's event is organized by the governments of Germany, Argentina, the Netherlands, and the NGO Outright Action International. My name again is Jessica Stern, and I'm the Executive Director of Outright, a global LGBTIQ and feminist organization with staff in 9 countries and global headquarters in New York, where we serve as the Secretariat of the United Nations LGBTI Core Group and a member of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. Because we convene this panel today in honor of June, which is celebrated as Pride Month in many countries around the world. And many of our participants today will be aware that the concept of Pride has evolved considerably since that fateful day in 1969 in the United States, when trans women of color and LGBTIQ people at the Stonewall Inn fought back against arbitrary arrest, blackmail and extortion, and other forms of abusive conduct by police. Today, Pride events take very many shapes and sizes around the world and are often called by more locally relevant and specific names. But nonetheless, it is a time that we commemorate. Tomorrow, Outright is actually publishing a report called Pride Around the World. And so I thought I would use some information from that forthcoming paper to just sort of set the context for this occasion. In places where a tradition of Pride is well established, Pride is often a celebration of the progress achieved towards LGBTIQ equality to date, and a reminder of the challenges that are still in urgent need of attention, such as banning sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts or achieving trans equality. In countries where Pride may be a newer event, it often serves as a protest, challenging social stigma or violence, affirming the existence of LGBTIQ people, and calling for the recognition of our human rights. And in many other countries still, prides are restricted, banned, or cannot take place at all due to restrictive legislation, pervasive intolerance, or even state-sponsored persecution. And I personally remember so clearly the year that the once thriving Istanbul Pride was countered by water cannons and riot police. So I say all that to acknowledge that we don't take our privilege lightly in being able to convene here today safely for a discussion in honor of Pride. And I'd actually like to ask for a moment of recognition for all those who want to hold their own Pride events, but have faced bans or been met with violence. So if we could have a moment of silence, please. Thank you. We appreciate that. I want to pivot to the specific topic that we've chosen to focus on today in the context of Pride. And I want to say it's quite special because we're here today to talk about a tool for fighting back against intolerance, foreign policies that are inclusive of LGBTI rights. And I want to say, for those of us that have been in the movement for a long time, we acknowledge that this is a newer discourse, but for those of us that work at the UN level, it's one that we're quite familiar with. And the point is that LGBTIQ movements are now demanding a symmetry, that their governments not only think about LGBTIQ rights in domestic policy, but also government obligations include addressing LGBTIQ rights in bilateral, regional, and multilateral contexts. And today we're not only going to hear from civil society about why this is so critically important, but we're going to hear from government representatives who've been doing the work themselves. As the co-chairs of the LGBTI core group, and in roles that go far beyond that one designation, Argentina and the Netherlands have long demonstrated their commitment to inclusive foreign policy, and we celebrate the work of the LGBTI core group and the work your governments do in that context. And this year, we also celebrate that on March 3rd, Hannah Rao was probably very exhausted because the government of Germany took a major step forward with the launch of its LGBTI Inclusion Strategy, which we, and I know especially my friend Sarah Court, warmly welcomed. It's a very strong policy. So I want to quote a few passages from it because it is, to the best of my knowledge, the most recent national level policy to explicitly embrace LGBTIQ rights as a foreign policy priority. So I decided to choose three. Let me see if I can get away with three quotes. Otherwise, I'll cut it to two. The first, the federal government ensures that people who do not conform to heteronormative gender roles are treated respectfully and appropriately in its administrative procedures and advocates for this in other countries too. This is so important. And it's at one time an affirmation that heteronormative gender roles are oppressive to Germans within Germany's borders, but also that countering heteronormativity is a foreign policy priority. And I love this next one. German foreign policy and development cooperation will provide structurally sustainable support to the LGBTI human rights work undertaken by civil society with particular attention to specific vulnerabilities and multiple forms of discrimination. And I love that because the policy honors the invaluable contributions of civil society and the fact that the LGBTI community is not monolithic, that anyone who experiences multiple and intersecting forms of vulnerability will be at heightened forms of discrimination. And then I can't resist the last quote because it comes in the context of so many things that I care about. The federal government the federal government seeks close partnership on the issue of international partners and actively participates in international alliances committed to LGBTI rights. For example, Germany is a founding member of the Equal Rights Coalition and a member of the Global Equality Fund and the LGBTI core group. And I think that's really important because the policy also acknowledges that for Germany or for any government to be successful in this capacity, it can't go it alone. That partnerships like the ones we're here to talk about today are essential to changing the global discourse and normalizing the simple but essential idea that LGBTI rights are human rights. With that, I want to talk about how to get there. I want to talk about how to imagine a world where LGBTIQ people experience full equality and dignity. And so we're going to start with a video message of welcoming remarks from Germany's Minister of State for Europe at the Federal Foreign Office, Michael Roth. Would my colleagues please cue the video? I'm not hearing any audio. Still not hearing audio.
Good morning, folks, to those of you in New York, and a good day to everyone with us online now. It's my great pleasure to kick off Pride Month with you all with today's event, Assisting Human Rights Defenders on the Ground, LGBTI Inclusion in Foreign Policy and International Development, with so many dear friends and partners. In the past weeks and on Ida Hobbit, we have highlighted one fundamental truth. Human rights are universal. They protect all and everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Still, the number of systematic attacks against LGBTI persons and LGBTI defenders is rising. They are being attacked not only for their courageous work, but also simply for who they are. Gay, lesbians, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and gender diverse people are targeted for transgressing expected gender norms and stereotypes. The current COVID-19 pandemic particularly affects minorities, and LGBTI persons are especially at risk of discrimination, violence, and harassment. The fight for equal rights for LGBTI persons is a cornerstone of German human rights policy. In order to make our work towards this goal more visible and to strengthen our support to civil society in this field, the German federal government adopted the Federal Government LGBTI Inclusion Strategy for Foreign Policy and Development Cooperation on the 3rd of March 2021. Through this inclusion strategy, we commit ourselves to consult with LGBTI communities and groups locally, regionally, and internationally. Throughout the drafting process, we worked closely together with civil society in order to ensure that the strategy takes specific issues into account and meets the needs. Let me highlight some of the points included in the strategy. We will mainstream LGBTI rights into our policies so as to systematically bring together the good work that many of our embassies are already doing. The strategy looks at the special situation of children, youth, and trans and intersex persons who can be more vulnerable to discrimination and abuse. It gives concrete examples on what embassies can do. This includes providing protected meeting rooms for activists or supporting threatened activists through visits, monitoring trials, and diplomatic means. Of course, we will also continue to support and fund civil society working for equal rights. Cooperation with like-minded partners, states, and civil society is a pillar of our inclusion strategy. Now we have the opportunity to discuss how we can work together to fight discrimination and ensure equal rights for all, so that love conquers hate. Thank you so much for your commitment.
We're so glad to have heard the minister's remarks. Thank you so much, Minister, for sending that video message. And I really appreciate the emphasis on providing not just a policy, but a directive that has concrete examples, for instance, of what embassies can do to activate the policy. That's excellent, and we hope to see a successful implementation across all German embassies. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. We're very fortunate to have with us today the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, Victor Madrigal-Borlos. Victor has been the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity since starting his term in January 2018. A Costa Rican jurist, Victor Madrigal is a senior visiting researcher at Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program, where he will be based until 2023. Victor, you're welcome to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. It's a privilege to be here today with you. As you can imagine, this is a topic that I've actually had the enormous privilege to witness firsthand in different aspects of my professional life. Most recently, I have the privilege of being the custodian of a mandate that was created very much as a result of the energies that exist in the space of multilateralism. The mandate of the independent expert is the result of the extraordinary visionary work of coalitions of thousands of civil society organizations put together with the energy of visionary states under the idea that political acknowledgement that sexual orientation and gender identity need to be recognized as points of entry into the analysis of violence and discrimination, if that analysis is going to be conducive to effective addressing and eradication of this scourge. And of course, around this process of creation of the mandate of the independent expert, a number of extraordinary bodies that have promoted dialogue and development, such as the Equal Rights Coalition, the Core Group, and most recently, only last week, the group of friends of the mandate of the independent expert based in Geneva. And of course, some of the persons present here today are part of that group of friends that I believe are going to be doing extraordinary support to this mandate. In short, if there ever was a case study possible to the way in which civil society, states, and other stakeholders can actually reunite energy to create institutionality that is then driven to action, that is the process that many of you participated on the creation of this mandate that I have the honor to be the custodian of. And there goes my first message in this brief or somewhat brief remarks. The first one is the importance of acknowledging how deep the connection is between the issues that we are talking about and the respect for multilateralism and dialogue within multilateralism. It appears to me that most of the developments under international human rights law have taken point of departure in deep respect of multilateral organizations and the work and the progress that is possible within them. It is also the case that some of the progress actually comes from regional organizations that repeat this idea of multilateral dialogue in full respect, but in constant evolution. Last Friday, I presented my annual report to the Human Rights Council, and I spoke of the perfectibility of the law to capture the perfection of human diversity in an acknowledgement that multilateral and regional organizations are the seat for much of the work in which we try essentially to make these legal institutions capture ever so much more this perfect diversity in which we have the privilege to exist. I just an hour and a half ago was having the great honor of speaking with the Argentinian ambassador, Ambassador Villegas, at the closing of yet another exercise that will provide you case studies about how this dynamic goes. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the mandate of the independent expert convened a series of joint roundtables to create a joint knowledge base in what will become the base for plans of action for the mandate and for the UNHCR in what concerns LGBTQI+ asylum seekers and refugees for the decade to come. Yet another example of how these institutions are driven by the knowledge. Of course, it will be states that take forward the actions that are recommended under this, but I just wanted to highlight to you something that Ambassador Villegas himself said. We had the contribution of 600 experts from civil society during the 3 weeks of roundtables that this process took forth. And so underlining this message is everything that we will know at this point about the main global challenges in the field of refugees and asylum seekers will come from that knowledge base that will have so significantly been fed by civil society that deserves, of course, decided support, not only in the provision of material resources to be able to carry out their work, but also very importantly in relation to the legal conditions under which it actually carries out their work. I wanted to mention in the context of this main theme that is actually convoking us today, the importance of these spaces of dialogue, be multilateral, be regional, be bilateral, to actually take point of departure as well in the overarching agendas that have been identified by multiple stakeholders around where is it that the main obstacles to development and the enjoyment of human rights are at the moment around the world. One of them is, of course, the scourge and the impact of criminalization. As we know, 69 countries still maintain criminalization, and with very significant impacts not only on the lived realities of individuals, women, men, and gender diverse persons within their jurisdiction, but also on the work of human rights defenders. I have constantly reminded states that criminalized environments not only create an environment conducive to blackmail and threats and violence, but also very importantly create an ever-present threat of criminalization of human rights defenders themselves. Something that we have seen materialized, quite unfortunately, many times over the last year around the world. Whenever campaigns are actually enacted, be it in criminalization or in the other overarching agendas of the international agenda in this relation, I would like to place on record, I believe, the importance that this be driven with coalition thinking, under the idea that local human rights defenders will be able to provide significant elements of input to the strategic thinking around these campaigns, and very importantly, ensuring that there's no possibility that any talk or enforcement of measures such as sanctions will create backlash against the local civil society, something that we have seen also materialize, unfortunately, quite frequently in practice. The minister was mentioning the issue of support through embassies as an instrumental part of these overarching systems of implementation. And I would like to wholeheartedly support the words that were mentioned in that connection. Embassies are extraordinary, create extraordinary possibilities for the creation of safe spaces, but also for manifestation of support that can be as concrete as the flying of the rainbow flag or the accompaniment of the occupation of public space by LGBT people in Pride marches. And I would wish to convey to you how many instances I've received over the last 4 weeks of claims and allegations of significant violence suffered by persons who were trying to actually put together their Pride events themselves. An integral policy is one that declares itself proud. I think Jessica Stern was actually mentioning this aspect. And I welcome very much some of the information that we've received over the last few days. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, dear friends all around my screen, that I think that one of such manifestations is the designation of commissioners or the figure of special envoys. I think that this is a sign of extraordinary support to the issue that allows particular representatives to have a vigorous and robust voice, even in those cases where the voice is as filled with diplomacy and wisdom as that of Jessica Stern. And so I think that we were yet to see great things in relation to implementations of measures such as this. My last word, as always, goes to the reality of the people that I meet on the ground, either in my promotional or my country visits. It is very often the case that I will meet with civil society that themselves feels alienated or divided or far away from diplomatic spaces. I very recently had the opportunity to hear manifestations about how the most disenfranchised, the most marginalized, perhaps the more poor and the more vulnerable, don't feel necessarily that embassies and diplomatic spaces are welcoming spaces for them. And so my last word would be for you, those agents of change that are working within diplomacy, to also, I believe, commit your best efforts to ensure that diplomatic spaces, diplomatic conversations will always be also felt to be welcoming spaces for all of those members of our communities, populations, and peoples. Thank you very much, and I look forward to participating in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Victor. You make it sound easy, but actually you've just designed a strategy for all of us for successful engagement with multilateralism, which I really appreciate. And I hope everyone reads your report because it's, I think it's an intellectual triumph, which is not something we can say every day about UN reports, let's be honest. So much appreciated. I'd like to make a couple of comments. I can't keep up with the chat, but I do see that the chat is quite lively. I'd like to make a couple of comments. One, Victor, I'd like to make you aware that a number of queer refugees from the Kakuma refugee camp have addressed questions to you. So at your convenience, we'd appreciate it if you would address them. I want to also just underscore that when we talk about the vulnerability of LGBTIQ people, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that anyone who is both LGBTI and also a refugee faces so much vulnerability and so much exposure to violence that it is really incumbent upon all of us to do what we can to ensure that all refugees are cared for, all refugees receive adequate food and shelter and permanent solutions rather than short-term crisis interventions, and that people such as the LGBTIQ refugees in the Kakuma camp are treated with respect, safety, and dignity. And so I know a number of people are here trying to bring attention to that situation, and we're reading your comments, we're hearing you, and we know that it's not just civil society listening to you today, but also governments and UN experts. I'd like to also acknowledge that there is a conversation happening that in the chat and that I want to sort of address head on. This conversation today respects the rights of the full spectrum of the LGBTI community. We respect lesbians, and we respect trans rights, and we respect everyone in between and beyond. And so this is to say that anti-trans comments will not be tolerated in this space, neither will anti-lesbian comments be tolerated. And if this is now your warning, we invite you to engage constructively. We value your voices, we value civil society, but homophobic and transphobic comments will not be accepted in this space. And so we're warning you now, and if it escalates, we will have to ask you to leave. We have to do that because we have to make sure that everybody feels safe, and there are a lot of lesbians in this conversation today, myself being one of them, and there are a lot of trans people in this space, many of my friends being among them, and we want to create space for everyone. I think I speak for all panelists when I say that's our priority. With that being said, I'm now turning to our panel, and I'd like to first invite Ms. Alba Rueda, who we're so fortunate to have with us today. Alba Rueda is the Undersecretary for Diversity Policies at the Ministry of Women, Genders, and Diversity. Undersecretary, it's an honor to see you again, and I'd like to ask you a question. We've seen that Argentina has often been a leader when it comes to LGBTI inclusion, both domestically and internationally. And I could rattle off examples like the 2012 Gender Identity Act or the 2020 Decree 721-2020, establishing the trans labor quota in the public sector, which I personally have quoted time and again because I think it's a revelation. I wanted to ask you what strategies are developed to generate public policies towards LGBTI people, and how really is a feminist perspective mainstreamed across other public policies? Thank you, Subsecretary Alba Rueda, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, Jessica. Muy buenas tardes a todos aquí. Te agregaría que soy una subsecretaria trans. Frente a tantos comentarios TERF, realmente agregaría que soy una subsecretaria trans, orgullosa de serlo, orgullosa de estar en este panel también, sabiendo que el trabajo por la visibilidad de nuestros derechos es absolutamente transversal y un compromiso político de todos en esta mesa, y entonces me parece fundamental recuperar esta categoría también en nuestra condición política. Por un lado, te agradezco mucho, hiciste referencia, Jessica, a un decreto sacado el año pasado, en septiembre del año pasado, el decreto 721, que incluye la cuota laboral de acceso al empleo para personas travestis y trans. Bueno, estoy muy, muy contenta porque de verdad en Argentina y digamos, sobre todo en la comunidad LGBTIQ+, está muy feliz y orgullosa de haber logrado digamos, un avance histórico el pasado jueves 24 de junio, donde digamos, este proyecto también se constituyó en una ley nacional, así que hoy tenemos, además de contar con la ley de matrimonio igualitario, ley de identidad de género del año 2012, hoy también tenemos una ley de cupo laboral travesti trans, Amancay Diana Zacayán, Loana Berkins, aprobada como ley, que incluye no solamente al Ejecutivo Nacional, al Poder Legislativo, al Poder Judicial e incentivos a las empresas privadas para que contraten y se promuevan los derechos de las personas trans en sus ámbitos laborales. Así que es un gran paso para nuestro país, y yo me quedé pensando también en el contexto de esta conversación, en este diálogo, qué aportes teníamos para hacer dentro de esta mesa. Lo primero que quiero decir es que para poder hablar en materia internacional, creo que nosotros, las personas que estamos ocupando espacios públicos, debemos resguardar que estos se cumplan puertas adentro. Entonces, lo primero que me parece que hay que resguardar es un acceso y un trabajo efectivo dentro de nuestras comunidades, dentro de nuestra sociedad, con la responsabilidad que ocupamos en este momento en la función pública. Eso, por supuesto, involucra para nosotras y para nosotros un trabajo transversal que implica una perspectiva de género y diversidad presente, no solamente en las áreas de gobierno nacional, sino también en las áreas de gobiernos provinciales y locales. Nosotras contamos con un Consejo Federal de Género y Diversidad, donde hay una mesa específica de trabajo en el eje de diversidad con las máximas autoridades provinciales para poder llevar adelante esta articulación, esta transversalización federal de políticas de género y diversidad. Y así también, y en materia internacional, para dar un poco la arquitectura de dónde se asientan estos planteos, el 17 de mayo, un día muy, muy hermoso también, sobre todo para la comunidad LGBTIQ+, bueno, el 17 de mayo el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores, Comercio Internacional y Culto generó una resolución en donde se instruyen a todas las áreas de trabajo internacional la labor de fortalecer y promover iniciativas y políticas públicas vinculadas a la promoción de los derechos LGBTIQ+. Este es un paso importante porque significa realmente poder estar promoviendo la perspectiva de los derechos LGBTIQ+, dentro de lo que es la acción que hace Argentina en el mundo. Y después decía que uno de los aspectos fundamentales para esto, creo que el gran aporte que tenemos que hacer, o que hacemos acá desde Argentina, es entender la perspectiva de diversidad y de género desde quizás recuperando la visión que trae el feminismo, la visión que trae el transfeminismo, que tiene que ver con el eje de las intersecciones. Nuestra territorialidad, la racialización de nuestros cuerpos, la variable de clase y por supuesto las implicancias que tienen nuestros cuerpos, nuestros géneros, nuestra vida, nuestra individualidad en contextos sociales. Bueno, principalmente este es el eje por donde se sitúan las políticas públicas hoy en Argentina. Yo creo que entonces estamos frente a un gobierno, pero también a un Estado que se ha consolidado en esta materia. La creación del Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad en el año 2019, el 10 de diciembre de 2019, ha planteado justamente en la primera línea de las políticas públicas todo el eje de la diversidad como parte prioritaria de gobierno. Por supuesto, no solo de un gobierno, sino también del Estado argentino de aquí en adelante. Así que estamos en plena etapa inicial de asumir agendas políticas históricas de profunda exclusión, pero que también con mucha claridad, sobre todo agravada por lo que implica la pandemia en este contexto. Pero creo que realmente la respuesta tiene que ver con tocar los ejes de la desigualdad material, de la desigualdad simbólica, de derechos fundamentales. El acceso al empleo de las personas trans y esta ley de cupo laboral creo que es una de las muestras de las respuestas frente a esa desigualdad estructural que viven las personas travestis y trans en nuestro país. Pero además de esto, creo que, digamos que el eje y uno de los puntos más fuertes es el abordaje también sobre las cuestiones vinculadas a las violencias por motivos de género. En Argentina, y creo que el punto de partida de cualquier política transfeminista significa reconocer la desigualdad social en la que vivimos, y sin duda una desigualdad que tiene implicancias en términos de violencia sobre nuestras vidas y sobre nuestros cuerpos, nuestras familias, y el modo en el que nos desarrollamos socialmente. En este punto hubo un cambio radical, paradigmático en materia de derechos humanos, que es todas las políticas que se impulsan en torno al abordaje de las violencias por motivos de géneros, que históricamente solamente contenían políticas para mujeres cis, hoy son políticas destinadas para poder abordar y trabajar también con lesbianas, travestis, trans, gays, no binarias. Con lo cual no se trata solamente de identificar los tramos de violencia, sino también abordar y gestionar a partir de eso. Nos parece fundamental, sobre todo, el eje de la prevención de la violencia a partir de lo que es el Plan Nacional de Acción contra las Violencias, uno de los planes directrices que involucra compromisos de los 22 ministerios nacionales y sus organismos descentralizados, y también, por supuesto, los espacios en los que el Estado tiene mayoría y participación, como por ejemplo en el caso de las empresas privadas. Todos ellos están atravesados por este Plan Nacional de Acción contra las Violencias, promoviendo no solamente un encuadre sobre las violencias en términos de el abordaje de identificarlas, sino también de cómo acompañar. Hay programas como el programa Acompañar, que es de apoyo económico para estas instancias, y además, por supuesto, digamos, resituar todos los centros integrales que abordan los ejes de la violencia para poder plantear la perspectiva LGBTIQ+. Así que uno de los grandes ejes que buscamos con esta agenda política es transformar el eje del abordaje de las violencias, no solamente en la prevención, sino también en el acompañamiento, algo que hace a los ejes fundamentales. Otro de los puntos es la descriminalización, y que hizo mención Víctor, es la descriminalización de las identidades trans en toda la normativa argentina. Nosotras establecimos lineamientos en torno a cómo hay todavía figuras que subsisten en normativas provinciales que criminalizan la prostitución, que criminalizan a las personas travestis y trans, y cómo estas prácticas refuerzan los aspectos de la violencia institucional hacia el colectivo trans y travesti en Argentina. Bueno, el trabajo que se desarrolla a partir de estos lineamientos implica mesas de trabajo con cada una de las provincias para la derogación de estas figuras contravencionales que sustentan la violencia institucional en nuestro país. Otro de los grandes ejes, y vos lo mencionaste, Jessica, también, tiene que ver con el eje de la identidad de género. Esto nos permitió trabajar principalmente en los sistemas de información, tanto de los registros civiles como de aquellos organismos que recuperan la identidad y emiten los documentos de identidad de las personas. Bueno, además de esto, nosotras estamos trabajando para modificar el sistema nacional, incluir en el Sistema Nacional de Información a la población LGBTIQ+. Esto es uno de los grandes objetivos, porque si hay algo que también tiene que ver con las violencias es la invisibilización de nuestras condiciones de vida. Estos son aspectos integrales. Sé que tengo que ir cerrando, pero me gustaría simplemente señalar, sí, lo sé, simplemente señalar y destacar. Sí, Jessica, ¿vos querías intervenir o me decías que me queda un minuto? Un minuto, perfecto. Bien, entonces lo que yo quisiera destacar en todo esto es que además contamos también con uno de los grandes puntos para trabajar a nivel Mercosur, que tiene que ver con las personas LGBTI migrantes. Me parece que si tengo que hacer una síntesis, para nosotros abordar el eje de las intersecciones significa también trabajar con los grupos poblacionales más vulnerados, y sin duda uno de los grandes desafíos del Estado es trabajar con las personas travestis y trans criminalizadas en Argentina en su condición de migrantes, sin el reconocimiento de sus identidades, y además, por supuesto, criminalizadas a partir de lo que son delitos menores. En síntesis y cerrando, me parece fundamental el trabajo que estamos haciendo, porque tiene que ver no solamente con reforzar una perspectiva LGBTIQ+, sino también hacerlo a través de nuestras condiciones de vida. Creo que este es el gran aporte que tenemos para trabajar intersecciones, políticas públicas que recuperen y reparen una historia de violencias y exclusión para las personas LGBTIQ+. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary. As always, it's so inspiring to hear about your work. I take notes when you speak because there are so many examples of best practices. It's really exciting. And one of the things that I really appreciate in your remarks, well, there were a couple things. One, I appreciate the emphasis on addressing the material inequalities that often are the manifestation of trans exclusion and also LGBT exclusion. And I also really appreciate that you talked about the concept of trans feminism and how in your work on trans feminism, you're trying to actually take on the framework of gender-based violence in a way that strengthens the framework for everyone, in a way that ensures that it's not just a heterosexual married woman who benefits, but all women. And we say that while noting that resources and funding for gender-based violence are woefully inadequate. Our straight and married sisters also don't get enough resources. We want them to get more resources, and we want our beautiful queer community to get more resources as well. So thank you for making that point so eloquently. I want to make this interactive as we're talking. We're going to go to my friend and colleague, Andrea Rivas, next. But before I put you on the spot, Andrea, I have a question for all audience members, because we are trying to sort of understand what's working. Simple question, yes or no. Have you ever felt seen by an LGBTI affirming diplomatic action? Have you ever felt seen by an LGBTI affirming diplomatic action? And if you could just put a comment or a yes, no in the chat, a yes, no will work. We just want to see how much more work we have to do. Let's see what the results are. Okay, Andrea, hello. Andrea Rivas is the co-founder, hello, and president of Familias Diversas de Argentina, also known as AFDA. Andrea, we know that civil society is integral to pushing states to adopt inclusive and responsive legislation and policy. We know that no government gets all its best ideas on its own, but actually it's civil society naming what the needs of the community are, proposing solutions, and demanding justice. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about the ways that you and other members of Argentinian civil society have worked to push for this change in Argentina, and how you continue to put the pressure on.
Bueno, primero, muchas gracias, Jessica, y a todos los organizadores por la invitación, por estar aquí. Sin lugar a dudas, se llega a algo como el cupo laboral travesti trans por un trabajo constante de años de militancia y de una construcción desde el activismo y de las bases del movimiento social LGBTQA+ argentino, influyendo en las políticas públicas. Y esto es un camino de mucho tiempo, ¿no es cierto? Primero se empezó con determinadas leyes como el matrimonio igualitario, la ley de identidad de género, y hoy quiero retomar la categoría de la cual se refirió Alba en este sentido. Llegó un momento en que ya empezamos a construir desde la sociedad civil también la categoría de que somos sujetos políticos. Y en este sentido, no es posible que haya una política de avance LGBTQA+, sin que la sociedad civil participe en la mesa de la toma de decisiones y participe también en las políticas públicas desde su diseño, desde el ponerlas en agenda, diseñarlas y alrededor de todo su proceso, porque después también va a estar participando en lo que va a ser el monitoreo y la implementación de esto. Entonces, es un camino de construcción que se ha hecho y que llega al día de hoy con esto, con la categoría de que somos sujetos políticos. Y indudablemente viene porque con esta lucha...
Andrea, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry. To our wonderful interpreters, we're so grateful you're here, but the audience is hearing interpretation from 2 English-speaking interpreters. Would it be possible to ensure that there's just one English-speaking interpreter? Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt, Andrea. We're going to go back to you now.
Sí, puedo continuar.
Yes, please start now.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Bueno, a lo que iba, esta categoría sin lugar a dudas tiene que ver primero, número uno, con todo nuestro trabajo y también con la convergencia de la voluntad política, ¿no es cierto? Y para eso también se requieren alianzas, un trabajo en los territorios y que los reclamos también se entiendan en esta clave, en la clave política. Y en la clave de que los estados también nos interpreten como sujetos de derecho. Como hoy está Alba para mí es un gran honor y va a ser un cambio porque hoy el Estado argentino tiene una conciencia transfeminista, con toda la implicancia que esto significa, porque va a ser una implicancia en el cambio de todas las políticas de las instituciones, ¿cierto? Y hoy estamos también reclamando que esto sea sumamente profundizado en todas las instituciones, como por ejemplo en la justicia. Y también es el ejemplo tuyo, Jessica, de que ahora también vas a cumplir un rol fundamental dentro de un Estado también muy importante. Entonces, esto es como se llega también a poder hacer cambios profundos, porque es allí donde tenemos que ir. Y en este sentido también quiero mencionar el nivel de participación que ha tenido la sociedad civil con estos cambios, ¿no? Al ser también parte como sujetos políticos. ¿Por qué? Porque antes no teníamos un ministerio de mujeres, géneros y diversidad, que específicamente dijera personas LGBTIQA+. Entonces, hoy todas las políticas se refieren a nosotros de manera expresa, y esto es sumamente importante, porque esto no quedaba claro, y nos ha jerarquizado también, porque antes era el problema que hay en muchos otros países de Latinoamérica. ¿Y quién se ocupa de nuestros derechos? ¿A dónde tengo que ir? ¿Tengo que ir a una secretaría? ¿Tengo que ir a un área? O sea, ya hacer un peregrinaje por todo el Estado porque no estaba claro. ¿Está dentro del término género? ¿Es donde están las políticas de las mujeres? ¿O está en derechos humanos? ¿O está en otro lado? Este peregrinaje lo hemos hecho un montón de veces y lo siguen haciendo un montón de sociedades civiles en países de Latinoamérica. Eso se terminó a partir del ministerio, que expresamente nos pone y nos llama por nuestro nombre, y donde también pone en la cabeza a nuestras voces también. Y en este sentido quiero referirme también a el ampliar, ¿no? Ampliar para que podamos participar. En esto también se necesita mucho de políticas, y porque luego esto impacta en las políticas exteriores de los países, como en este momento Argentina está con el Reino Unido compartiendo el mandato de la ERC, de la Equal Rights Coalition, donde es un foro de participación donde están las organizaciones sociales junto con los Estados miembros. Entonces esto es muy importante también, facilitar el acceso de las organizaciones sociales a los foros internacionales donde están los estados, para que las comunidades podamos tener un acceso más cercano a los estados. Porque, y en esto, por ejemplo, los programas, en este sentido el programa de Outright, del que la verdad que tengo realmente el honor de estar participando como becaria de las Naciones Unidas en el programa de Fellowship de Human Religious de Outright, realmente este tipo de acciones concretas son las que se necesitan puntualmente, porque nos facilitan a defensores de derechos humanos poder llegar más fácilmente y conocer los derechos y las herramientas que tenemos para poder interactuar con los estados. Entonces se tienen que ampliar las participaciones, también en lo que dijo Alba anteriormente, con este concepto transfeminista y en la diversidad de lo que es nuestra propia diversidad, con pueblos originarios, LGBTIQA+, con digamos, las personas de las zonas rurales, de los barrios de emergencia, y esto ha quedado demostrado en lo que fue la pandemia, ¿no es cierto? El COVID-19 no hizo más que dejar en carne viva las inequidades que ya existían y que no iban a abordar un cambio hacia las causas estructurales. Y esto es lo que se hizo con Argentina, y se hizo en Argentina junto con la sociedad civil. Entonces, para cerrar, mi recomendación es trabajar junto con la sociedad civil, porque si se trabaja junto con la sociedad civil, realmente las brechas de las desigualdades, los estados las van a cerrar rapidísimo. Fíjense, como una acción positiva, como la del cupo laboral travesti trans, que se da en el caso de la pandemia, nada más ni nada menos que en el caso de la pandemia, puede estar cambiándole la vida a toda no solo a las personas travesti trans, sino el cambio de concepto también social que vamos a tener. Así que ir hacia el trabajo de abordar las causas de las inequidades estructurales junto con la sociedad civil, indudablemente va a ser un camino más corto para reducir las inequidades. Eso para los estados. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for your eloquence and power, as always. You made a number of comments that I really appreciated. You named an example of a best practice that meant a lot. And you said, a ministry calling us by our actual names. That really resonated with me. It's such a simple way of showing respect. It goes a very long way. Of course, we want, the redistribution of wealth and good laws and policies, but we also just want to be seen as we identify. So thank you for saying that. And also thank you so much for making so clear that that part of your strategy that has led to success has been having a seat at the table from the very beginning in policy design. And I think that's a model for success for lawmakers who actually want their policies to be effective. So I think that was really helpful. All right, I'm going to pivot now from Argentina and we're going to go to the Netherlands. I want to call now on Joka Brandt. Joka, it's so wonderful to have you here. Joka Brandt is the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands at the United Nations. Ambassador, the Netherlands has been a longtime leader and supporter of the rights of LGBTI people, both domestically and internationally. I marvel at the fact that you declassified homosexuality as a mental illness in 1973. You're the first country to have an equal marriage law, but I'm an activist and many of us on this call are activists. So we're not just content with what you did in the 70s. We want to know what you're doing today. So can you tell me a little bit about the way you continue to push today for LGBTIQ rights domestically and internationally?
Well, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. And indeed, we're very proud to be part of these events. And you're absolutely right, especially during Pride Month. We, of course, need to celebrate, but we also need to see what still needs to be done, by all of us. And well, it's clear, as we've heard today, but also seen in the chat, that LGBTI persons still face discrimination and violence. And as you've said, the Kingdom of the Netherlands firmly believes and has believed for a long time that everyone should be able and free to unapologetically be themselves, no matter who they are or who they love. And that is also why the promotion of equal rights for LGBTI persons has been one of the central priorities, not just domestically, but also for our foreign affairs and human rights policy for many years now. And I fully agree, I will not sort of dwell on that, but I fully agree what you said, and I think also the German minister and Victor, that working through our embassies is really crucial. I've seen myself, working in several of our embassies, that providing safe spaces for human rights defenders and LGBTI activists is really, really crucial. And I would also like to congratulate the government of Germany on their LGBTI inclusion strategy. We also believe, as the Netherlands, that only through strong cooperation and partnerships will we be able to make progress. And of course, that's first cooperation between countries in different regions. And that's essential because equal rights for LGBTI persons are a concern for all of us, no matter which part of the world you are from. So we work together with other countries in the Equal Rights Coalition, as member of the UN Human Rights Council, and as a co-chair here of the UN LGBTI Core Group. and also as the group of friends that Victor just mentioned for your mandate that's just been established in Geneva. Second, cooperation and partnership with civil society cuts across all our human rights and in fact all our work. The Netherlands is one of the main partners and donors of the LGBTI organizations globally, because these are the organizations with the expertise, skills, and experience to appropriately address discrimination and violence. And they also provide essential input for further development of our own strategies. We were asked to also look at good practices, so let me give you two. One is our partnership with Coc Netherlands. Through this partnership, we are able to reach dozens of local LGBTI organizations and activists, helping them to build capacity and supporting them to meet their own objectives. But the partnership also helps to address situations at a more strategic level. I'm sure we all remember the situation in Chechnya a couple of years ago when many gay and trans people were arrested, tortured, and killed. And we worked very closely with COC, both to get information, but also to find ways to provide emergency assistance and to discuss political options. And we didn't always agree, but for us, that is an important part of being true partners. The second good practice is Shelter City. In partnership with civil society and municipalities in the Netherlands, Shelter City provides human rights defenders who are at risk a shelter in a Dutch city for 3 months. And during this period, they're able to rest, re-energize, gain new skills, extend their network, and also raise awareness about the situation in their country. This then will help them to continue their important work with fresh energy and inspiration when they get back home. And, you know, importantly, they will feel that they are supported when they're back home as well. And the fact that many participants in the Shelter City program are LGBTI activists is again a clear sign that this type of support is badly needed. So in the interest of time, these two good practices that I think are examples of many ways in which governments can play a role in supporting the LGBTI movement. And I think it's great to see that more and more countries are now taking up this role. And we look forward to continue to working together, you know, with governments and with civil society, because as we said in the beginning, there's still a lot to be done. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I really appreciate your emphatic eloquence. And this is why it's so good to now have you in New York, even though we only see you virtually. I do believe you are in New York. And I think it's quite interesting to think about the responsibilities we have, not only to think about safe cities as a national concept, or not only to think about how we can create safety at the national level, but how we can go a step further and think about cities that can function almost as sort of places of safety in otherwise hostile environments. You know, I mean, we know that there's a false dichotomy. Some would say the place to be safe if you're LGBTIQ is in the city, but we know LGBTIQ people continue to live in rural areas and suburban areas as well. But there's no doubt that cities have been places where LGBTIQ civil society and therefore access to services have been available. So I think that project sounds really amazing. And thank you for sharing it. It's my great pleasure now to go to a highly regarded colleague from Dutch civil society. I'm so happy to have Emmy Veenhoven here with us, representing Coc Netherlands. Emmy, my question for you. Coc Netherlands is the oldest existing LGBTI organization in the world and has undoubtedly played a significant role in the progress seen from the government of the Netherlands, both domestically and internationally. So I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the gains that you've achieved and also what you see in the road ahead. And I would like to also note that there have been a number of questions about the situation for refugees, specifically in the Kakuma refugee camp. And we're going to give Victor Madrigal an opportunity to speak as soon as we get through our panel. Emmy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you for that wonderful question. It allows me to dream so big, and hopefully I know that Ambassador Joke is listening, so that's a good opportunity. Yeah, we were established in 1946, and obviously we are not the organization today that we were back then. And at the start, decriminalization in the Netherlands was on our agenda. The simple right to exist was on our agenda. And if you're established in 46 and you achieve marriage equality in early 2000, that there's a journey that leads to that. And I think when we look at the Netherlands, is the way that we've been able to work together. It's very interesting how we've been able to sort of inform also the international and the foreign policy of the Netherlands, and that's always been a collaboration. I'm not going to claim all the all the credits for that, because you need a government that's willing to listen, and we've been very lucky in that perspective. That obviously came that wasn't granted on day one, but I think we're in a good place. And we have been for a while, where we really have an open dialogue and a collaboration. And I think that's very special, and it's something that we really value. We've been strategic partners with the government of the Netherlands for several years now, and that allows us to work together in a way that's very, very constructive. So if I just look at our international work, we have been able to not only receive funding for international projects, but really work together on a diplomatic level, both at the UN in New York, but also at the UN in Geneva, and through the embassies. So, for example, what would happen is that if we look at a universal periodic review, for example, through our funding, we are able to support local activists in writing shadow reports. Through the advocacy week that we organized together with ILGA World, we're able to bring activists from grassroots organizations that probably normally wouldn't have found their way at the UN, give them access and make sure that that access is to diplomats that are willing to listen, that are willing to take their recommendations, take them to the floor and make them or give their country a SOGI specific recommendation. And that has been a real success that we're really proud of. And the Netherlands also in Geneva has been really supportive of that and always willing to talk to our activists or the activists in our programs. And what the Netherlands has allowed us to do, not to work just with the activists in our focus countries, but also work with activists outside of that perimeter. And that makes it really exciting to bring this diverse group of activists to Geneva, obviously permitting travel restrictions at the moment, but this is a really exciting process. And it also, another thing that I really value in our collaboration is something that Victor already hinted on, is the working together with embassies. So what we would normally be able to do is that if there is an emergency in a country or something happens, then we directly connect with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the embassy in the country and see what the possibilities are, what the movement really wants, what grassroots organizations tell us that is needed, and to coordinate that action in a way that is most effective. And that is also, for example, something that we do with special procedures. So it really creates a robust system in which we're able to work, not just to support the organizations on the ground and strengthen their local activism, but also do that on an international level. And I think the key to that is to have to listen to each other, to have dialogues, and recognize that also we as COC, we have a sort of a bridge function. We're not here to determine the agenda. We're not here to say how a country should make progress. This is something that really comes from the grassroots level, and to really listen what the different organizations, LGBTI organizations, but also specifically trans and intersex organizations want, where they want to go, where they see opportunities, and work together to achieve that.
Great, thanks so much, Emmy. And I really like hearing that you're in a long-term partnership with the Dutch government. I wonder if you're monogamous or non-monogamous in that. But the concept there, well, you don't have to answer that question publicly, but the concept is there's an ongoing relationship. And I think the ongoing relationship builds mutual respect.
Sorry, I was going to say it's really important to be open and have good communication around that. So we don't have an relationship with the,
it's with not maybe, but that's sort of your point, right? That it's not an exclusive relationship. That you don't think it should be an exclusive relationship, because the Dutch government is going to benefit from working directly with grassroots LGBTIQ civil society in and around the embassies and around the world. So thank you for making a political point out of my joke, Emmy. That was great. And now we're going to leave the Netherlands, at least virtually, and we're going to go to Germany. And it is my pleasure to start with Dr. Hannah Rau, who is the expert and LGBTI focal point in the Federal Foreign Office. Dr. Rau, we're so glad to have you here today. I know how hard you worked on the policy, so I want to appreciate you on this global stage. Good policies don't just happen because of mandate, they happen because good people work really hard and do a lot of consulting and worry about every the and every comma and every subsection. So we see you. I wanted to ask you to tell us a story of how the inclusion strategy came to be and the government's plans around implementation.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. And I think the thanks you just expressed and the appreciation, that's not only, it goes to a lot of shoulders and a lot of people and civil society as well. And I'm sure Sarah Coc can maybe highlight a bit of that later. So it's really been a joint effort. And I just want to say it's really inspiring to be here with so many representatives from governments and civil society working on the joint cause. And it really shows that how good it is to work together and how much we can really achieve together. So I just wanted to thank everyone here. And I just wanted to use the opportunity to also congratulate you, Jessica, on your appointment, especially. And I think that's a really important step, and I'm sure you'll be able to do a lot of good. I know my minister would have loved to congratulate you in person, but he was so eager to make time to pre-record his message. He was just a little early before the appointment. So congratulations on that. Yes, the story of the drafting. Yes, it's a little longer than we'd wished when we started the story. So it goes back to, and I'm sure Sarah can also jump in later on maybe the civil society part, but it's the government committed to this strategy in 2017. And then it was a joint drafting from Federal Foreign Office and the Ministry of Development Cooperation, because in Germany that's two different ministries. We worked really closely with civil society to make sure the document we came up with was something that would be useful not only for our colleagues in the embassies, but also for civil society, and would really address the issues and the concerns there. And so we had a few rounds drafting, and then we also, because it's a government strategy, we included all ministries. So of course that was also a long process, but that also meant that in the end we have a document that has been approved by government as such. So it also is a document that we can use and refer to also in our internal work. And just to kind of, because that came up early in the discussion earlier, one of the points civil society highlighted when we were talking to them, and that we managed to get in there, was inclusive language, because in Germany that's not a sort of standard in government policies, and just because it's like important to really address the people we're talking to. That was one of the points we were quite proud of to be able to keep in there. And and we also managed, I hope, in the Spanish translation and English translation, and the Spanish one, to have a bit of that in there as well. So when we were drafting, so basically the document looks at the sort of situation we find, so we have discrimination and violence. We look at the approach you want to have, human rights-based approach, specifically vulnerable groups, and then it looks at kind of areas of action that includes internal action. So how can we do internally in awareness raising in our sort of internal policies as a ministry? What can we do? What do we need to do? And then it looks specifically at foreign policy and development cooperation. So how can we work together in these areas? And sort of what we have in there is maybe also what do we need to do to implement it? And so that's not a really easy answer on how are we going to implement it, because there's not one answer. So it's not sort of me working in the human rights division, I'm going to implement it. No, the idea is to have a strategy that we can all implement together. So all our embassies on the ground, because working together with civil society. And because we see that if we really want to achieve change, we want to improve the situation, it's something where we need to work together as states and as government. And I mean, of course, as states doing human rights work as a diplomat, it's really, it's good, it's a safe job, it's a secure job, and we want to make sure that we can use our position to support all those out there for who being a human rights defender, specifically for LGBTI rights, is not a safe job. It's a really courageous job. My job won't put my loved ones at risk. I know there are lots of those out there that for them it's totally different. So we want to make sure we can work together. So we want to try and work with partners, and some of the formats we work with partners in have been named here today. And we want to have all our embassies working on it, because we see that the strategy for each country can be very, very different. Because in some countries, it's about being really outspoken. And I know we've had a lot of questions from embassy recently on how can they kind of show the rainbow flag, specifically when the discussion came up now in Berlin, and can we illuminate the Munich stadium in rainbow colors? A lot of embassies saying, what can we do, especially from Budapest, so how can we show the flag? So really, there are all those people out there thinking about what can they do. A lot of questions on, okay, what kind of, how can we support the pride in our city? How can we have a statement together with others? All these points coming up from different people. And we try to work specifically with civil society in these countries to see how, okay, what are the changes we can do? What is the best strategic way? What kind of ideas are from being safe spaces, of course, and looking at going out there, visiting human rights defenders at risk, showing up, going to trials if there's trials against human rights defenders. But then also we have a specific human rights defenders support program. It's not only LGBTI, we set up recently on offering support, also sort of short-term support in Germany or in the region for human rights defenders at risk. There's a whole kind of bunch of possibilities, and we try to see what is the most effective for each country, also working together with partners on the ground, with other like-minded countries, and also close contact with civil society here in Germany. So often we get like an email from civil society here saying, look, from our partners, civil society, we've just heard this about developments in country XYZ, and then we can pass it on to colleagues here and see what can we do, what would be the best way for doing it. And then, but it's not only my colleagues in the embassies, but we're also trying to hope that the strategy we adopted can be used for civil society as a sort of entry point to get in contact with our embassies. And that's why we don't only have a German version, even if we sort of drafted it in German, because as it went through cabinet, it had to be in German, of course. But then we quickly got an English, and I also have a Spanish translation to make sure that's an entry point for civil society to read, to say, oh, look, it says embassies can do these kind of, offer these ways of support. No, I want to try and see what the embassy, the German embassy in my country can do. And that's already one of the points we really hope it can be used as well. And of course, we also have sort of like small human rights projects on the ground in different countries, designed differently depending on the countries, to make sure we offer support for civil society. So basically, it's just kind of, that was maybe the easiest step to sort of draft the strategy. And now it's kind of up to lots of colleagues to use it, and lots of civil society work as well to really work to improve the situation.
Dr. Rao, it's always so good hearing you present. There was a line in your remarks that stood out for me, and I think you went off script and you were speaking from the heart, and you said, "My job won't put my loved ones at risk." And I really appreciate that you said that. And I think that's the kind of humility and consciousness that we ask governments that seek to protect and defend LGBTI rights to have, because the human rights defenders on the front line are potentially risking everything. And I also really appreciate that you said drafting the strategy was maybe the easiest step. And we always come back to this because it's really important to have good laws and policies, but if they just sit on a shelf, then their promise will be unfulfilled. So I know all of us in the audience watching you are going to be cheering the government of Germany on, and also doing our part to hold you accountable and coming to the embassies and coming to Berlin to try to ensure that there's follow-up with this great policy. I'm so delighted that my friend Sarah is our final speaker. Sarah, we have about 10 minutes left, so you get the honor of having the last word. And then I'll just wrap up the panel. My colleague Victor is going to put something in the chat about the situation of refugees. Victor, I'm not sure if we'll have the ability to come to you, but let me look at Sarah and see if maybe we could leave like 2 minutes for Victor, Sarah, if that's possible. Great, I'm getting thumbs up. Sarah, you know my mantra is that all good things that happen, all good change for LGBTIQ people begin with civil society. So I know you personally worked on the German government's inclusion policy for a very long time. And I wanted to ask you, I didn't even introduce you, I just went right into talking to you. Sarah Kort is the project manager at the Hirschfeld Eddy Foundation in Berlin and the coordinator of the Jakarta Alliance, a civil society network aimed at the inclusion of LGBTI people in German foreign policy development cooperation. So that being said, Sarah, how did you, with your many hats on, work to obtain this gain when it comes to the German foreign policy initiatives?
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much for this event, and thank you for the invitation. The Hirschfeld Eddy Foundation welcomes the LGBTI inclusion concept, and with this plan, the German government acts on long-standing requests from civil society since 2011. Let me sketch a quick timeline. In 2011, LSVD and Hirschfeld Eddy Foundation initially formulate the demand. In 2012, the Jakarta Alliance, named after the principles, is founded. In 2017, the Ministry of Development and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced to draft a concept. In the same year, the Jakarta Alliance publishes a comprehensive list of requirements, the 13-point paper. Between 2017 and 2020, 3 hearings or consultations with civil society and the ministries take place. And in March 2021, the final approval by the cabinet happens. Many of the requirements from our 13-point paper have been taken up. I would like to highlight 2 aspects. First and foremost, the focus on LGBTI civil society. We have always called for a comprehensive cooperation and continuous dialogue with LGBTI groups on the ground in the partner countries. These voices on the ground need to be heard, and local LGBTI organizations need to be sought and actively approached. Second, the reflection on the colonial past. The inclusion plan references the missionary history and the responsibility for colonialism. We do need, that's what we think, a serious and self-critical examination of the missionary and colonial history of donor countries, including the second largest, Germany. Strikingly, the states that are now promoting the human rights of LGBTIQ people are the very former colonial powers that have introduced the laws criminalizing homosexual behaviors and often trans identities in the first place. This is why decriminalization often is an aspect of decolonization. And the now progressive countries need to be aware of their own history of persecution and discrimination. So what we say is know your own history of persecution. This is crucial to allow credible and legitimate international cooperation. I have 4 hopes for this strategy. First of all, more funding. We need more projects. Second, more action. We need new forms of development cooperation, and we need what we call a post-colonial course of action. Thirdly, we need more knowledge. I sure hope, first of all, that all the embassies and all implementing agencies of the Ministry of Development, like the GIZ, etc., will know this concept and act accordingly. A fourth thing we do not need, or we need less. This is administration. We need to make sure that small NGOs are also able to do or to participate in development cooperation. This applies to those in the partner countries as well as to those in Germany. Because it's mostly the LGBTI organizations that are in touch with the other organizations. So if I may say one line at the end, please follow the intrinsic intersectional path of the concept that has just been drafted.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate that. And I appreciate that you clearly have articulated a vision for not just fighting for the German inclusion policy, but for the next steps to animate it and ensure that it has real and concrete impact in LGBTIQ people's lives. And you were very thoughtful about the issue of timing. And there have been a number of colleagues who've posted about the situation in the Kakuma refugee camp. And now I'd like to ask our colleague, Victor Madrigal, to say a few words. And I'd also like to ask all of the representatives of governments who can stay on for a few extra minutes, if you could send me a private message, because I'd like to ask you a follow-up question or give you an opportunity for a final comment, but I know we're supposed to end in 3 minutes. So please message me while Victor is speaking. Thank you.
Jessica and colleagues and friends, thank you for your generosity in allowing me to say a couple of words in relation to this very important issue that, of course, is heartbreaking to all of us. Heartbreak is, of course, not enough to those that are in the circumstance, and I realize that, so I wanted to share with you a little bit of information. First of all, I think it's important to place the plight of LGBT persons who are forcefully displaced in context. We know that we just reached the horrifyingly historic number of 82 million refugees worldwide. While unfortunately we don't have disaggregated data on how many of them are LGBT, considering the realities of criminalization and stigma, but we know that there are many. Yet, yearly, all resettlement places existing in the world is about 250,000. The solution, therefore, is not automatically resettlement. We acknowledge in the need for solutions that look systematically to, first of all, addressing the root causes of forced displacement, including criminalization that lies at violence, pathologization, and discourses of antisocial content of LGBT lives. Every step of refugee and asylum seeker transit needs to be considered and studied to make sure that conditions are the best possible. Reception conditions and safe accommodation, this is particularly important for Kakuma. And finally, of course, all conditions existing in resettlement. My mandate maintains a trilateral engagement in relation to Kakuma. I've engaged the Kenyan state, I have engaged the UNHCR, and I maintain engagement with groups of refugees in relation to what is a very complex situation. And while it is impossible to address all details in a quick chat, I would like to say that the elements that we are constantly trying to understand and act upon include an understanding of the violence and threats of violence that actually exists within the community and from outside the community, and as well as the realities of social exclusion that the persons are confronted with and that also contribute to the dynamics of violence. My suggestion, further than this, is that any interested persons consult the correspondence that I maintain in that process. It's in my webpage that I'm going to place in the chat. And I'm happy to receive information and establish interlocution through the mail in this connection. Very much ensuring that this is an issue that is at the forefront of my conversations with UNHCR, which are now held almost on a bi-weekly basis. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Victor. We appreciate your comments and the gravitas with which you approach this issue, and the fact that you are helping to consistently raise these issues with UNHCR. Not everyone has regular access to UNHCR, and UNHCR is an agency that is always underfunded and always trying to serve many vulnerable people. So we appreciate you trying to put a finer point on the community's experiences. I'm going to keep us on for a few additional minutes. I'm thinking 10 minutes. Subsecretary Alba Rueda, there was a question specifically to you from Mariana Ruiz. So I'd like to put this question to you, and there were a couple of additional questions as well. I'm going to read this out to you. Mariano says, gracias Alba por tan claro mensaje. Sin embargo, con respecto a personas migrantes y refugiadas, refugiadas LGBTIQ, es importante reclamar la urgente apertura de fronteras por causas humanitarias. 469 días de fronteras cerradas ponen en riesgo a las personas LGBTI. ¿Qué medidas se están tomando desde el Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidades? ¿Cómo quiere responder?
Bien, gracias. Muchísimas gracias. Ahí escuché tu español, me alegra mucho. Gracias, Jessica. Gracias a la persona que nos consultó. Mira, lo primero que quiero decir es que para nosotros era recuperar una normativa importante, que es el planteo sobre la migración que hizo Argentina hace muchos años, y que esto se vio obstaculizado por determinadas normativas que pertenecieron a otros gobiernos. Puntualmente, para nosotros fue importante la derogación de un DNU, el DNU 70-109, que es un DNU directamente que era inconstitucional, pues modificaba la ley de migraciones y establecía un proceso arbitrario y sumarísimo para expulsar a las personas migrantes, en general, no específicamente sobre las personas trans. Este DNU se ha derogado, y me parece que actualmente se ha derogado durante el año 2020, y volvió a estar vigente nuevamente la ley de migraciones en el estándar de derechos humanos que está planteado en Argentina. Argentina tiene una de las leyes migratorias más vigorosas en la región, y esto creo que es uno de los grandes pasos para poder destacar en la protección de los de los derechos de las personas migrantes. En particular, en el contexto, las medidas que se adoptaron sobre la migración en este punto, por las medidas sanitarias de pandemia, y me gustaría comentarles que en Argentina tenemos altos niveles, digamos, todavía de transmisión de COVID, con lo cual todavía las fronteras no están abiertas para esto, pero lo que nos permitió trabajar, y esto sí creo que es importante, es generar los indicadores para acordar la idea de los refugios. Los refugios, las categorías de refugio desde la perspectiva de género y diversidad. Esto es el impulso que estamos llevando adelante, así que creo que estamos organizando todo un estándar de derechos para cuando la pandemia lo permita, podamos abordar más puntualmente el eje de la migración bajo estas condiciones. Eso me gustaría comentar, que recuperamos un marco normativo y que además, digamos, en derechos humanos, y además estamos trabajando específicamente por incluir indicadores de identidad de género dentro de las variables de refugio, de la valoración de los refugios por motivos políticos.
Thank you so much for that clarification. I don't see any questions addressed to a specific speaker at this point, but I'd like to ask a general one. Nisha Ayu says, in a country like Malaysia, where Islamic laws have a high influence on the government and its laws, it's really worrying to see the issue of the community always being used as a tool or as a scapegoat that further increases discrimination, hatred, and violence. Current laws against gender identity, sexuality, and expression are now being discussed by states, basically to strengthen. I think what she means is criminalizing laws. And then she asks, is there a platform or any best practices from an Islamic country that can help us continue our advocacy? So I just want to put this question out to the whole panel, because we've all seen some of the most tenacious and creative LGBTIQ activists are working in Muslim majority countries. So we know that they're making change happen. Is there a story that comes to mind for you about activism that was effective or interventions that made a difference? Please help us end on a high note.
I don't have immediate immediate best practices, but I'm sure if I ask my colleagues, there are plenty. And I think what's important to realize in these situations is this is not Islam specific. This happens in Christian countries. This happens in Islamic countries. This is a fundamentalism which uses religion, which uses scapegoating tactics. And I think we have to be really careful in how we talk about this, because otherwise it gets unjustly put on the religion instead of an oppressive regime. I do note that there's organizations that specifically work on with and on faith issues and with faith leaders. So that might be an avenue to approach. But I'm more than willing to be in touch and share any best practices, or put Nisha in contact with people who could potentially help her, because I think it's a very valid question. And like you pointed out, Jessica, there's fierce activism going on. And I think that is crucial, and support for that is crucial, but also, support and dialogue for that.
And maybe just
Go ahead,
listening to you, there's one thing, I mean, just for example, with one project we also co-funded from the Salzburg Global Forum on LGBTI rights, kind of faith is linking discussions from faith leaders, religious leaders, and LGBTI communities. They're really putting out positive stories. So I don't have all the examples here, but I think if you can go online, and that you can find a lot on there, and it's really a lot going on. Because that was one of the projects when I thought and was looking at project proposals, we're like, okay, this is really, really interesting, really, really good, because just as you said, it's not sort of, it is a general pushback as well. We also see it sort of specifically on women's rights. So it's really nice to have project on the positive side, kind of looking at good stories and kind of empowering the people on the ground to sort of link up and exchange best examples. And maybe just because we were speaking about the refugee camp a lot, just kind of maybe to highlight, it's only a small part in our strategy, like 2 sentences, but we're also working closely with the sort of department in the foreign ministry that does humanitarian assistance and crisis engagement, and sort of they're really looking at strategies and how to make their support and their programs inclusive and sort of take into account all the diverse needs of all the different people, because I think that's also a really, really important thing. It's also an ongoing thing, and I know they have sort of specialists really working on that and how to make sure. And then again, of course, depending on which country you're looking at, you have to frame it maybe differently just to make sure it reaches this. You can sometimes say leaving no one behind is maybe a kind of strategic way of putting it, but you know what it means, and sort of equal rights for all. So, and again, it maybe goes to it's a job, and we need lots of shoulders, I mean, a lot of people sort of to work together to make change.
I like that saying. That's the perfect note to end on. I want to draw this panel to a close. Thank you so much to everyone for staying on as long as you did. I think it really shows people's commitment to having this conversation. I don't think this is an easy conversation. I think the area where LGBTIQ rights and foreign policy intersects is relatively new and evolving. And I think everyone who volunteered to be a speaker in this conversation is here because we want more. You know, we want more resources, we want more policies, we want more implementation, we want more follow-up, we want more dignity and safety for LGBTIQ people. And I think you all expressed that with great power and eloquence today. So I can't believe we still have 75 people that have stayed on a panel for this long. Thank you to our amazing audience for joining us and participating with such power and energy. Thank you to each of our speakers. We really value you. And I wish everyone not only a happy Pride, but a political Pride, whatever that means to you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.